It comes from the last day of Jesus' life, really, and it's the betrayal of Jesus and his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's a story that's told in all four Gospels, and each one of them has a little bit of a different point. Each author uses it as something of a symbol to explain the whole meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection. And again, in this one, I like it particularly today because it's like Jesus saying, just enough, right? Enough. While he was still speaking, a crowd came, and one who was named Judas among the 12 was leading this crowd. And he approached Jesus to try and kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, is it with a kiss that you betray me? And when those who were around him saw what was coming, they asked, "O Lord, should we strike him with a sword?" And then one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, "Enough of this," and touched his ear and healed him. We've had a lot of emotional reaction to the shootings in Parkland, Florida, because it's an emotional subject, as it should be. You can see people visibly having to control themselves, the parents who've lost a child, somebody who lost somebody who sat next to them in honors English class. They can barely keep from screaming and crying all at one time. It's very intense to watch them go through it. And you know what that's like. I'll never forget the day that my sister-in-law died. She was probably 43 years old at the time. My brother called me on the phone. I just got in the car and drove down to Capitol Hill in D.C. where his family lived. By the time I got there, my nieces and nephews were home from school. I really hadn't thought about seeing them when I walked in the front door. But as I got in the house, they were in the upstairs bedroom lying on the bed. I have a nephew who's a special needs kid. He was probably 14 years old at the time. Today he stands 6'7". Probably then he was already 6'5", a man-child of sorts. There he was, curled up in a fetal position on the bed, numb, just like a little boy who needed his mom. And I didn't know what else to do, so I did what his mother would do, I suppose, and laid down on the bed next to him. I just hugged him from behind, but what a terrible, awful moment that was. The abandonment, the fear, the incredulity, the frustrated rage. I remember in those days and weeks right after she died, sometimes I'd call my brother and he was so sad and he was so confused. I didn't think he was actually going to get out of bed. And sometimes you can get so sad that you're actually afraid to start crying because you wonder if you'll actually be able to stop. It's a powerful thing, all those subterranean motions around life and death. And we know from talking to our neurologists that chemicals get released in our brain when we go through these traumatic experiences. And sometimes, right as you're in the middle of being deluged with trauma, you can feel that hormonal shift in your personality so that this whole other person begins to emerge, a person that you don't even come into contact with day in and day out. And real fear, life-threatening fear, suddenly changes you dramatically. It's palpable. You can feel it intensely, even as you're aware that you're making decisions that you'll probably alter in the future. And I think most of our country understands this. And then sometimes I wonder if we really do. We had the raw emotions of parents that were speaking in the midst of their loss. They were struggling with their composure. They were struggling with their logic, even as they spoke, because they're just spiritually overcome and spiritually traumatized. The next day, we have other people that experienced the whole event with them, saying that what we just need to do is arm our teachers. By the way, if you're worried right now that I'm going to jump into a debate over guns, don't worry. I'm not even going to get that far today. But the particular solution reminded me of a conversation that I had with my 18-year-old son upon the occasion of his deployment to Afghanistan in 2002 or 2003. He had just finished basic training. He was stationed with the 25th Infantry as a scout. His job was to do reconnaissance in the mountain passes of Tora Bora. He was looking for Osama bin Laden and the other leaders of Al-Qaeda. And before he shipped out for his active deployment, he came home for a visit. And when he was home for a visit, two of us had a moment together alone. So I asked him the question, Ian, how does the Army train you spiritually to kill a man? And he was quiet for a while, and then spoken just like an 18-year-old boy. He said to me, I don't know, Dad. They have you practice and practice and practice so that when you actually get there and pull the trigger, it's not a big deal. I thought to myself, there's a reason we draft 18-year-old boys to fight our wars for us. It's no big deal. It's no big deal. As his father, I wanted to stop and pray for him right then and there because I know it is a big deal. I know it's probably going to be the biggest deal of his life. We humans are not wired to dismiss trauma. We don't get by it easily. Sometimes we don't get by it ever. When I was 13, I was walking to school one day with the same guys that we walked to school with pretty much every day on our way to school. We were walking on the side of the road next to oncoming traffic. And one of my friends, there were four of us, who's at the back of the pack, steps out to say something to all of us. And he steps out into the road at exactly the same time as the truck was veering too close to all of us. The truck hit him, threw him about 20 yards in the distance. He crumpled on the side of the road. 8th grade. I remember we were so big. Boys jumping into an emergency suddenly become little men. We all took off our coats and our shirts. We covered him as best as we could. His skull, of course, was crushed. Loss of blood was catastrophic, but we jumped into doctor mode. We were going to do what we were supposed to do. They took him away in an ambulance. I'm sure he was dead when they took him away. What I remember is the driver that hit him. He kept going over what happened, over and over and over and over, saying the same things one more time. It was like he kept hoping that if he could go over it again and again, carefully enough, something would change and you'd get a different outcome. I moved from there a year later, but I stayed in touch with my friends. And years later, like when we were going to college, I got a note from one of them. He told me that driver used to send him periodic updates on changes that they were making to that piece of the road where my friend died. Changes had been made. They installed a crosswalk. There were some warning lights. I can't even remember all the details. But that driver that killed my friend sent the other boys that he had addresses for pictures of that section of road looking much safer now that it was zoned. 8 years on, 10 years on. This guy is still going over and over and over that day in his mind, trying to undo something. That driver was haunted probably for the rest of his life. Probably not that different from Lady Macbeth, who had her deep regrets about her complicity in murder. She's washing her hands, and she's washing her hands, and she's washing her hands. And finally, she yells out, "Out, out, damn spot." And it just won't go away. It won't. And that guy could not get that incident out of his head. And I can't even remember if it was really his fault or if it was just one of those terrible accidents. But he was guilty in his mind, guilty in a way that he would never be able to get over it. And years later, he still wanted to reach out to the boys that he had hurt in the hopes that somehow we would be mature enough to extend to him a forgiveness that his own conscience would not grant him. He couldn't get by it. And trauma's like that. It stays with you long after you're ready to be done with it. And I think about this all the time. When your children come back from the war, they're permanently changed. And they don't even know how they've been damaged, but they're just not the same. And I've talked to the young men in my son's unit. They only had 9 because he's in a recon unit, very small group. And if you talk to them, none of them think that they experienced anything that was exceptionally traumatic. Yes, people die in war. Yes, some of these incidents are very difficult, but no, none of them is particularly imperiled or unable to go on with their life. It's nothing like that. But a higher percentage of our veterans use heavy drugs and use heavy alcohol than the regular population. A higher percentage of our veterans have trouble developing meaning back in their civilian life, which seems boring and without purpose relative to when they were deployed. A higher percentage of our veterans have trouble getting their careers on track because their work doesn't engage them front and center. It's like their lives are off, but they're not derailed. And what we have been traumatized, just being together with that unit is a good thing for each of them. It's not like they sit around and talk about their trauma. It's more that they just know that the only people in the world that can really understand them at some level are the guys that they served with. But none of them thinks of themselves as traumatized. None of them is exceptional. Everyone went through the same thing. A couple years after Ian came back from Afghanistan, I had to participate in our Memorial Day parade with a lot of the other politicians, of course. The flags is marching, it's springtime. One of our politicians got a little wound up with patriotism that day, spotted a couple of vets out in the crowd, asked them up on stage for the Pledge of Allegiance. One of them was my son. I could see both of the vets with an expression like, "Don't make me do this." Sure enough, before we could get to the actual pledge, our politician started thanking them for being heroes, and you could see both of them just looking at the ground, waiting for this unasked for praise to pass. And I don't know, they may be heroes. That's not the way that they look at themselves. They didn't do anything that anybody else wouldn't have done. They didn't suffer more than anybody else suffered. And I sat there thinking the obvious. They don't see themselves as heroes. They think of themselves as wounded. Not a hero in victory, just a guy trying to recover from his wounds, trying to figure it all out. And by the way, these are our trained warriors. These are the people we draft to be in the Green Beret and the Navy SEALs. And they have a significantly difficult time getting on with their life and making peace with themselves and developing a basic meaning and purpose in civilian life because of what we've put them through. It's that negatively impactful when we go to war. I do think of these women and men as heroes because of what they've taken on so that we don't have to take it on. We owe these people. 15 years ago, I was downtown on a Bridges run just before Christmas. Our confirmands were handing out soup and sandwiches and Christmas presents that were donated by everybody here at the church. Someone had a boombox on in line. They were playing a song on the radio by Sly and the Family Stone. It was a #1 hit back in 1969. So I'm, oh man, I come to life. I'm out there just moving along. Some of the other guys are dancing around to the music, waiting for their food. So I said to them, December 1969, where were you? What were you doing? You have to be of a certain age to answer that question, of course. But it brought back the era in just an instant. First guy says, I was in Da Nang. Second guy says, I was traveling up Haiphong Harbor. Third guy says, I was about to deploy from Fort Hood, Texas. Almost all the homeless guys that are over 60 years old are Vietnam veterans. It's a national disgrace. I don't know why it took me so long to make the connection. I'm an idiot. But I have never looked at our homeless guys quite the same. Sometimes I still try to see the traumatized boy inside those layers of woundedness that made these guys homeless survivors. We owe these people for what we put them through, and we didn't have to go through ourselves. When I heard people endorsing teachers to be armed so that they can defend their students during a mass shooting event, I'm just surprised how naive we are about human nature. Because I know that if you take another person's life, even under the best of circumstances completely justified by defense, even when precaution is observed and proper protocols followed to the T, even then, it is incredibly difficult, and you never get by this. Never mind that about 20% of all our soldiers trained engaging the enemy, 20% of them do not fire their weapons for a number of complicated reasons, not the least of which that they're momentarily overwhelmed with aggression and terror. Never mind that a large percentage of people who survive a traumatic event like this, somewhere around 20%, develop full-blown symptoms of PTSD. They have persistent headaches that won't go away. They have nightmares. They experience flashbacks. They have hyper-anxiety unto depression or paranoia. They have withdrawal and avoidance of other people. They experience significant repression, emotional numbness. They're hyper-aroused, jumpy all the time, and irritable, always on edge. And it's the last two that cast the longest shadow over your life. They are filled, whether it should be or not, with guilt and shame. Whether or not it's deserved, it can and it will define an entire generation. All of Syria today, most of Iraq, most of Yemen, most of Afghanistan, half of Pakistan. You know, at the end of World War I in Europe, so many people had been involved in trench warfare. So many people experienced death as arbitrary. Some people just dying by sheer accident. Other people just living by sheer accident. That after the end of the war, as a generation, they could not adjust back to normal again. A whole generation in Europe, they were reckless. They lived every night with abandon. Every weekend in Germany after the end of World War I, thousands of these alienated young men would gather together in places like Munich and put their uniforms on, like they were still in the army, although they weren't. They'd get staggeringly drunk, like it was the last night of their life. They were reaching for something extraordinary to try to feel, because inside they had nothing going on. Inside they were burnt out, they felt nothing, and they would do anything wild to escape that. Because being married was so boring, because doing your menial job was so boring, and the unemployment rate was just staggeringly high. Why did I survive? Why did my best friend die? Eric Maria Remarque described it so well in All Is Quiet on the Western Front. The way that survivor guilt morphs into generational despair and destroys families and cripples lives and can ruin an entire generation. We've been through this as a society. We know how bad it is. In 1928, when we were reflecting on the horrors that we went through in World War I, Congress passed the Kellogg-Briand Act that promised never to use war to resolve disputes again. We outlawed war in our Congress. And by the way, France and Germany signed that pact with us. They outlawed war too. We knew just how awful it is. You cannot live in that type of trauma. And now our children and their children are begging us and pleading us not to be subjected to this regularly recurring trauma in their schools. They're afraid, they're anxious, unsure, and antsy. What kind of world are we creating for them by allowing this to regularly recur? Why can't we raise them in love with trust in their people so that they trust in the world, so that they're optimistic and oriented by hope, so that they're imaginative and curious about different cultures and different traditions? What will it take for us to become intentionally focused on the foundations by which our children and their children will flourish? My brothers and sisters, we come to the communion table to remember the one who chose the way of reconciliation and forgiveness, the one who absorbed spiritual trauma that we might not have to. We come to be pointed again towards the way of communion and healing and harmony in the place of what is fractured, what is broken, what keeps us alone and isolated and hurting. Come and bring your brokenness. Come in hope for healing, healing for one another, healing for our communities, for our families, healing for our nation. Come. Amen.